You're walking through the respectable streets of Birmingham in 1855, past elegant townhouses with their pristine facades and manicured gardens. The Industrial Revolution has created unprecedented wealth, and nowhere is this more apparent than in these middle-class neighborhoods where successful merchants and factory owners display their prosperity through architectural grandeur. Behind one of these impressive doors lives Isabella Thornfield, 22 years old, recently married to Samuel Thornfield, a prosperous textile manufacturer. To the outside world, Isabella has achieved every woman's dream: security, respectability, a place in society. But if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, you might hear something that doesn't belong in this picture of domestic bliss. The sound of muffled crying, the crack of the hand against flesh, the desperate whispered prayers of a woman begging God for strength to survive another night. This is the reality behind the lace curtains of Victorian marriage, a reality so brutal, so systematically oppressive, that it would remain hidden from history books for over a century. Tonight, we're pulling back those curtains to reveal what marriage truly meant for women in Victorian England. This isn't the romanticized version of period dramas with their swooning heroines and gallant gentlemen. This is the documented reality of legal slavery, sexual trauma, and psychological destruction that millions of women endured in the name of respectability and social order. Isabella's story begins not on her wedding day, but on the morning she turned 18, when her father received a business proposal that would forever alter her fate. Samuel Thornfield, 20 years her senior, needed a wife to enhance his social standing and provide him with heirs. Her father, facing financial difficulties in his own business, saw an opportunity for strategic alliance. The negotiation took place entirely without Isabella's knowledge or consent. She was, in the words of legal doctrine, disposed of like any other piece of property. The legal framework that governed Isabella's life was called coverture, a doctrine so comprehensive in its oppression that it defies modern understanding. The moment Isabella spoke her wedding vows, she ceased to exist as a legal person. Sir William Blackstone, whose legal commentaries defined Victorian jurisprudence, explained it with chilling clarity. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Suspended, as if she were a clock that had stopped ticking, as if her very existence had been placed on hold indefinitely. Isabella Hartwell, daughter, sister, individual human being with thoughts, desires, and dreams, vanished the moment she became Mrs. Samuel Thornfield. Every possession she had inherited from her mother, jewelry, books, even her clothing, now belonged legally to Samuel. Her small inheritance, carefully saved by her grandmother, became his property. Any wages she might earn through work would be his by right. She could not sign a contract, could not sue or be sued, could not write a will, could not even seek medical treatment without his explicit permission. But the loss of legal identity was only the beginning of Isabella's nightmare. Victorian society had constructed an elaborate system of deliberate ignorance, designed to keep young women completely unprepared for the realities of marriage. Isabella's education, like that of all respectable young ladies, had been carefully limited to accomplishments that would make her attractive to potential husbands: a little French, some watercolor painting, piano performance, and domestic skills. But about the most fundamental aspect of married life, the physical relationship between husband and wife, she knew absolutely nothing. This ignorance wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated and ruthlessly maintained. Dr. William Acton, one of Victorian England's most respected medical authorities, declared that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. Any woman who displayed signs of sexual knowledge or desire was considered morally suspect, possibly even suffering from nymphomania, a supposed medical condition that required treatment. Young women were taught that good wives endured their husbands' physical advances as a duty, like attending church or managing servants. Isabella's mother, bound by the same culture of silence that oppressed all Victorian women, could offer only vague warnings about submitting to your husband's needs and doing your duty. When Isabella pressed for more specific information, her mother became visibly distressed and changed the subject. The conspiracy of silence was so complete that Isabella entered marriage knowing less about sex than a 12-year-old today might learn in a basic health class. The wedding night, which should have been an introduction to intimacy between two people who cared for each other, became instead a traumatic assault that left Isabella physically injured and psychologically shattered. Samuel, following the accepted wisdom of his era, believed that his rights as a husband were absolute and immediate. He had purchased Isabella through marriage, and he intended to take possession of his property without delay or consideration for her feelings. The bedroom became a site of regular violence that the law not only permitted but actively protected. Marital rape was not just legal, it was considered a logical impossibility. The marriage contract included the wife's permanent consent to sexual access. As one judge ruled in 1855, the same year as Isabella's marriage, a husband cannot be guilty of rape upon his wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband. Isabella's daily life became a careful choreography of survival. She learned to read Samuel's moods, to anticipate his anger, to minimize her presence when he was drinking. The servants, bound by loyalty to their employer and the social conventions that made domestic violence invisible, pretended not to see the bruises that Isabella carefully concealed beneath high-necked dresses and long sleeves. They averted their eyes when they heard her crying, crossed themselves when they encountered her in the hallways, and whispered prayers for her soul while doing nothing to protect her body. The economic trap that held Isabella was as secure as any prison. She had no money of her own, no means of earning an independent living, no legal right to leave her husband's house. Even if she could somehow escape, where would she go? An unmarried woman without financial resources was considered a burden and a scandal. Her family would be obligated to take her back, but only at the cost of their own social standing and economic security. The shame of a failed marriage would taint not just Isabella, but her sisters, making their own prospects for respectable marriages nearly impossible. Victorian society had created a perfect system of entrapment. Women were denied education that might make them financially independent, denied access to most professions, denied the right to control their own money, and then told that marriage was their only option for security and respectability. Once married, they discovered that the security came at the price of their freedom, their dignity, and often their physical safety. The medical establishment provided scientific justification for women's suffering. Victorian doctors, almost exclusively male, developed elaborate theories about female psychology and physiology that conveniently supported male dominance. They argued that women's reproductive organs made them inherently unstable, prone to hysteria, and incapable of rational thought. Any complaint about marital treatment was dismissed as evidence of feminine weakness or mental instability. Dr. Henry Maudsley, a prominent Victorian psychiatrist, wrote that the monthly activity of the ovaries affects the entire nervous system, making women unsuitable for sustained intellectual work or independent decision-making. When Isabella attempted to discuss her husband's violence with the family physician, Dr. Richardson, he prescribed laudanum for her nervous condition and suggested that her complaints might be the result of an overactive imagination influenced by her delicate female constitution. The rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, became a common treatment for women who showed signs of distress in their marriages. This therapy involved complete bed rest, isolation from family and friends, and prohibition of all intellectual activity including reading and writing. The goal was to break women's spirits and force them into submission. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who survived this treatment, later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, describing how enforced inactivity and isolation drove women to genuine madness. Religious institutions provided divine sanction for women's oppression. The Church of England taught that female subordination was God's will. Punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Pain in childbirth was considered divine justice. Domestic violence was described as a cross to bear, an opportunity for spiritual growth through suffering. Ministers regularly quoted selective biblical passages. Wives, Submit yourselves unto your own husbands, while ignoring verses about mutual love and respect. Isabella found herself caught in a theological trap as confining as her legal prison. When she sought guidance from Reverend Whitaker, her parish minister, he counseled patience and forgiveness. He suggested that her suffering might be God's way of testing her faith, that resistance to her husband's authority was resistance to divine will itself. The church that should have provided sanctuary instead became another institution reinforcing her captivity. But even within this system of total oppression, women found ways to resist and support each other. Isabella discovered an underground network of communication and solidarity that Victorian society never acknowledged, but could never completely suppress. Women developed coded languages for discussing their experiences, shared information about birth control and abortion, and created informal networks of mutual aid that operated beneath the radar of male authority. Catherine Thornfield, Isabella's younger sister, became her lifeline. At 19, Catherine had witnessed her sister's transformation from a vivacious young woman to a frightened shadow of her former self. Understanding that her own marriage would likely follow the same pattern, Catherine began secretly educating herself about women's rights and legal protections. She smuggled books to Isabella, shared information from women's rights publications, and helped her sister document the abuse in a hidden journal that would serve as evidence. If escape ever became possible, the Thornfield sisters were part of a growing network of women who communicated through seemingly innocent social calls, charity work, and church activities. They passed information about sympathetic doctors who might provide contraception, about legal loopholes that might offer protection, about safe houses where women could temporarily escape violent husbands. This network operated through coded conversations, hidden letters, and whispered consultations that took place under the cover of respectable female activities. Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, one of the first licensed female physicians in England, secretly provided medical care to abused wives whose husbands refused to allow them to see doctors. Dr. Anderson documented injuries, provided contraception despite its illegality, and offered safe spaces for women to discuss their experiences without fear of betrayal. Her practice became a crucial resource for women like Isabella, who had nowhere else to turn for help. The women's temperance movement provided another avenue for resistance. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union ostensibly focused on the evils of alcohol, but they became spaces where women could discuss the real connection between drinking and domestic violence. Temperance meetings gave women socially acceptable reasons to leave their homes, organize with other women, and develop leadership skills that would later prove crucial to the suffrage movement. Writing became both a form of resistance and a way of documenting women's experiences for future generations. Women like Frances Power Cobb published essays about wife torture, breaking the silence around domestic violence. Despite facing severe social criticism, Caroline Norton's very public battle for legal reform after leaving her abusive husband helped expose the legal disabilities that trapped married women. These women paid enormous personal costs for their activism, but their courage created the foundation for eventual change. The Industrial Revolution that had created Samuel Thornfield's wealth also created new opportunities for women's employment, though these were carefully restricted and poorly paid. The rise of department stores, telegraph offices, and schools created jobs for unmarried women. Though marriage remained the expected goal, some women, like Isabella's friend Mary Harwick, chose to remain unmarried rather than risk the legal and physical dangers of marriage, accepting the social stigma of spinsterhood as preferable to marital slavery. The birth control movement, though officially suppressed, provided another form of resistance. Women secretly shared information about withdrawal, douching, and primitive barrier methods that might prevent pregnancy. Annie Besant's pamphlet, The Law of Population, though it resulted in her prosecution for obscenity, circulated widely among women desperate to limit their families and preserve their health. The Malthusian League, though publicly focused on population control, provided practical information that gave women some degree of control over their reproductive lives. The legal reform movement began to gain momentum in the 1850s. Just as Isabella was beginning her married life, Caroline Norton's campaign for custody rights and property protection brought public attention to the legal disabilities of married women. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 would eventually give women some control over their earnings and inherited property, though these reforms came too late to help Isabella's generation. The contradiction between public ideals and private reality created psychological trauma that Victorian medicine couldn't understand or treat. Women developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. But Victorian doctors interpreted these symptoms as evidence of female weakness rather than responses to abuse and oppression. The epidemic of nervous disorders among Victorian women was actually a rational response to irrational circumstances. Isabella's hidden journal, discovered years after her death, provides a window into the daily reality of surviving an abusive marriage in Victorian England. Her entries reveal not just the physical violence she endured, but the psychological strategies she developed to maintain her sanity and humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. She wrote, "I have learned to disappear inside myself, to find a place where his hands cannot reach, where his words cannot penetrate. In this inner sanctuary, I remain Isabella." Though the world sees only Mrs. Thornfield, the journal also documents the small acts of rebellion that kept hope alive. Isabella secretly taught herself to read Latin so she could understand legal documents. She memorized the locations of women's refuges. In other cities, she saved tiny amounts of money by selling her needlework, creating an emergency fund that she hid in a hollow space behind her bedroom wall. These preparations may seem pathetic by modern standards, but they represented enormous courage and determination within the constraints of her circumstances. The network of resistance that sustained Isabella included women from all social classes. Sarah Mills, a factory worker whose husband drank away his wages, shared information about pawn shops that would loan money to women without male permission. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, a wealthy widow, secretly funded safe houses for women escaping violent marriages. Hannah Price, a midwife, provided both contraception and emotional support to women trapped in abusive relationships. The rise of women's magazines, though carefully censored, provided another form of communication and solidarity. Publications, like the Lady and Woman's World, published advice columns that offered coded discussions of marital problems. Readers learned to interpret phrases like household management difficulties as references to domestic violence, nervous exhaustion as code for marital rape, and family financial concerns as discussions of economic abuse. The suffrage movement that would eventually transform women's legal status was built on the foundation of networks like the one that sustained Isabella. The women who chained themselves to Parliament railings in the 1900s were often survivors of the kinds of marriages that had destroyed previous generations. Their demand for political rights was rooted in bitter personal experience of legal powerlessness. The cost of Victorian marriage extended beyond individual suffering to encompass entire families and communities. Children who grew up witnessing systematic abuse learned that violence was normal, that women existed to serve men, that power was exercised through cruelty. Sons learned to dominate, daughters learned to submit, and the cycle perpetuated itself across generations. The economic impact was equally devastating. The waste of human potential represented by millions of intelligent, capable women trapped in domestic servitude represented an enormous loss to society. Women like Isabella, who showed early promise as writers and thinkers, were systematically prevented from developing their talents or contributing to intellectual and cultural progress. The medical consequences of repeated pregnancies, domestic violence, and psychological trauma shortened women's lives and compromised their health. Maternal mortality rates remained high throughout the Victorian era, not just because of medical limitations, but because women's bodies were weakened by constant stress, poor nutrition, and repeated physical assault, the transformation of marriage from an institution of oppression to one of partnership did not happen overnight. It required decades of struggle by women who faced enormous personal costs for their resistance. The legal reforms, social changes, and cultural shifts that eventually improved women's status were built on the courage of women, like Isabella, who refused to accept their subordination as natural or inevitable. The hidden history of Victorian marriage reveals the mechanisms by which systematic oppression operates and maintains itself. The combination of legal, economic, religious, and social institutions created a web of control so comprehensive that resistance seemed impossible. Yet women found ways to support each other, to preserve their dignity, and to plant the seeds of eventual liberation. Isabella's story did not have a happy ending in the conventional sense. She never escaped her marriage, never found the romantic love denied to her generation, never achieved the independence that would be available to later generations of women. But she survived. She maintained her humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. She contributed to the networks of resistance that would eventually transform society. And she left a record of her experience that helps us understand both the horror of oppression and the power of human resilience. The Victorian era's treatment of women in marriage was not unique in human history, but it was uniquely well documented and systematically justified. The same patterns of control, the same mechanisms of oppression, the same strategies of resistance can be found in other times and places, adapted to different cultural contexts, but following the same basic logic of domination and subordination. Today, as we close this examination of Victorian marriage, we return to that Birmingham townhouse where Isabella spent her married life. The lace curtains that concealed her suffering have long since crumbled to dust. The walls that heard her tears have been torn down and rebuilt. But the echo of her experience remains, a reminder that the rights and freedoms we take for granted were purchased with the suffering of women who came before us. Isabella's voice, preserved in her hidden journal, speaks across the centuries with a message both heartbreaking and inspiring. Though they may own my body, though they may control my circumstances, though they may silence my words, they cannot possess my soul. In the deepest chamber of my being, I remain free, and in that freedom lies the seed of hope for all the daughters who will come after us. The Victorian era may be over, but its lessons remain relevant. The same forces that created and maintained women's oppression in the 19th century continue to operate in different forms today. The same strategies that were used to justify systematic inequality are still employed to defend other forms of discrimination and abuse. The women who survived Victorian marriage were not passive victims, but active agents of resistance, whose courage and determination laid the foundation for the rights and freedoms that followed. Their story is not just about the past, it is about the ongoing struggle for human dignity, the continuous need for vigilance against oppression, and the eternal power of hope to triumph over even the most systematic attempts to crush the human spirit.